Laughter echoed through courtroom 302. Judge Harrison Sterling wiped a tear of amusement from his eye, looking down at the self-represented black man standing before him. It was supposed to be an open and shut case, a quick conviction. He had no idea the trap had already been sprung. 34-year-old Henry Thomas stood perfectly still amidst the stifling heat of the Chicago courtroom. He wore a faded navy suit that had clearly seen better decades, let alone days. The jacket pulled slightly at his broad shoulders, and the cuffs rested a fraction of an inch too high above his heavily polished but undeniably scuffed dress shoes. He did not possess the sleek, predatory aura of the lawyers who usually occupied this space. Instead, he stood with the quiet, immovable dignity of a man who had already lost everything except his mind. Across the center aisle, Assistant District Attorney Alex Pendleton adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian wool suit. Pendleton leaned back in his leather chair, sharing a knowing, arrogant smirk with the man sitting behind him in the gallery, Richard Hayes, the billionaire CEO of Omnitech Solutions. This was not a standard criminal trial. It was a corporate execution disguised as state justice. Henry was facing 3 counts of grand larceny, corporate sabotage, and violating the Economic Espionage Act. The prosecution claimed he had stolen Omnitech's revolutionary data compression algorithm, an algorithm worth billions, wiped their primary servers, and attempted to sell the proprietary code to a foreign shell company. In reality, Henry had spent 5 years developing that algorithm entirely on his own time before Omnitech hired him. When Hayes discovered the gold mine Henry was sitting on, Omnitech used a maze of fabricated employment contracts to claim ownership, fired Henry, and used their immense political leverage with the district attorney's office to bury him in criminal charges before he could file a civil suit. They wanted him locked in a federal penitentiary for 20 years. They wanted his silence. Judge Harrison Sterling reigned over room 302 like a feudal lord ruling over a particularly tedious fiefdom. Sterling was a man who had built a 30-year career on swift, merciless judgments, particularly against those who lacked the funds or the complexion to fight back effectively. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, his black robes pristine, and his patience famously non-existent. He had a well-documented reputation for lunching with corporate executives at the Chicago Club and playing golf with senior partners from the city's most ruthless law firms. Sterling tapped the handle of his gavel against the heavy mahogany block. His lips curled into a sneer. "Mr. Thomas," Judge Sterling drawled, his voice dripping with aristocratic condescension, projecting effortlessly to the back of the gallery. "I see we are back to this charade. The court strongly advised you at your arraignment to accept a public defender. Yet, here you are, clutching what appears to be a legal pad from a dollar store, insisting on representing yourself. A man who represents himself has a fool for a client, as the old saying goes. Are you quite sure you wish to play lawyer today?" Soft chuckles rippled through the prosecution's table. Pendleton leaned over to his co-counsel, whispering something that elicited another round of snickers. Henry did not flinch. He did not blush. He slowly opened his battered, second-hand leather briefcase and extracted a perfectly organized stack of documents. "Your Honor," Henry spoke. His voice was a rich, calm baritone that completely lacked the nervous tremor Sterling was accustomed to hearing from pro se defendants. "Under Ferretta v. California, 422 U.S. 806, I have a guaranteed constitutional right to proceed pro se, provided my waiver of counsel is voluntary and intelligent. As I stated during the pretrial hearings, I am fully prepared to defend myself against these baseless charges." Sterling rolled his eyes, resting his chin on his hand. "Memorizing a Supreme Court case from Wikipedia does not make you Clarence Darrow, Mr. Thomas. This is a complex felony trial involving intricate digital forensics and corporate law. It is not an episode of Law and Order. If you stumble, if you fail to adhere strictly to the Illinois rules of evidence, I will not hold your hand. I will sustain the prosecution's objections, and you will likely find yourself in a state penitentiary before the leaves change color. Do we understand each other?" "Perfectly, Your Honor," Henry replied, his expression unreadable. "I ask only that the court applies those same rules of evidence equally to both sides." Sterling's eyes narrowed dangerously at the perceived slight. "Sit down, Mr. Thomas. Let's get this over with. Mr. Pendleton, call your first witness." Brenda Fowler, the court stenographer who had worked in room 302 for 15 years, paused her typing for a fraction of a second. She glanced up at Henry. In her long career, she had seen hundreds of pro se defendants crash and burn. They usually shouted, cried, brought irrelevant documents, and alienated the jury, but there was something chillingly methodical about the way Henry had arranged his table. His pens were perfectly parallel. His documents were tabbed with color-coded sticky notes. He wasn't acting like a desperate man. He was acting like a surgeon laying out his scalpels. Pendleton stood, buttoning his suit jacket with a theatrical flourish. The state calls Richard Hayes to the stand. Richard Hayes walked to the witness stand, exuding the quiet arrogance of a man whose net worth exceeded the gross domestic product of several small island nations. He swore on the Bible with a practiced, trustworthy smile, directed squarely at the jury box. For the next 2 hours, Pendleton led Hayes through a devastatingly smooth direct examination. Hayes painted a picture of Henry Thomas as a brilliant but deeply unstable engineer. He described Henry as a disgruntled employee who felt underappreciated, became hostile toward management, and eventually went rogue. "Mr. Hayes," Pendleton asked, pacing slowly in front of the jury, "can you describe what happened on the night of October 14th? "It was a nightmare," Hayes said, shaking his head sorrowfully. "Our cybersecurity team detected a massive unauthorized data transfer. Mr. Thomas's unique credentials were used to access the secure vault containing our proprietary Project Apex algorithm. He copied the data to an external, encrypted drive and then executed a malicious script that wiped our primary servers to cover his tracks." "And did this cause damage to Omnitech Solutions?" "Millions of dollars in structural damage to our network, not to mention the near total loss of an asset that took our teams years to develop." Hayes lied flawlessly. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. No further questions," Pendleton said, returning to his seat. He cast a pitying look at Henry. "Your witness, Mr. Thomas. Try not to get lost." Another round of stifled laughter from the gallery. Judge Sterling sighed heavily, looking at his gold Rolex. "Mr. Thomas, you may cross-examine the witness. Please try to keep it relevant. I have a luncheon at 1 o'clock. Henry stood up. He buttoned his cheap suit jacket, picked up a single sheet of paper, and walked slowly toward the podium. The courtroom was dead silent, waiting for the inevitable train wreck. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," Henry said, his voice polite and even. "Morning, Henry," Hayes replied, his tone dripping with fake paternal disappointment. "Mr. Hayes, on direct examination, you testified that my specific, unique credentials were used to access the secure vault on October 14th at 11:43 p.m. Is that correct?" "Yes, it is," Hayes said. "And you are entirely certain of this fact because it was recorded in the company's internal digital server logs?" "Objection," Pendleton drawled from his chair, barely lifting his head. "Asked and answered. The witness already testified to this." "Sustained," Judge Sterling barked immediately. "Move it along, Mr. Thomas. Do not waste the court's time." Henry didn't blink. "Mr. Hayes, as the CEO, are you familiar with Omnitech's standard protocol for physical security specifically, the biometric scanners at the server room entrance?" "I am generally familiar, yes." "Does a person need to physically scan their fingerprint to enter the server room where the terminal for the secure vault is located?" "Yes." "I would like to direct your attention to what has been marked as Defense Exhibit 4, Henry said, stepping forward to hand a document to the bailiff, who handed it to Hayes. "This is the physical building entry log for October 14th. Can you read the last time my fingerprint was registered entering the building?" Pendleton shot up. "Objection, Your Honor. Foundation. Mr. Thomas is attempting to introduce evidence without properly authenticating the document or establishing a chain of custody." Judge Sterling banged his gavel. "Sustained. Mr. Thomas, you cannot simply wave pieces of paper around and expect them to be admitted. The jury will disregard the question. Sterling looked down at Henry with absolute disdain. This is exactly what I warned you about. You don't know the rules. My apologies, Your Honor, Henry said smoothly. Allow me to lay the foundation. Mr. Hayes, do you recognize the signature at the bottom of that page? Hayes looked at it, slightly confused. It looks like the signature of our head of physical security, David Miller. And is it standard business practice for Mr. Miller to generate and sign these logs at the end of every week? Objection, hearsay, Pendleton shouted. Henry pivoted instantly, looking directly at the judge. Your Honor, I am establishing the document under the business records exception, Federal Rule of Evidence 8036. The witness has just identified the signature of the custodian of records and confirmed it is standard business practice. Judge Sterling's face tightened. He hated being cornered by procedure, especially by an amateur. He glared at Pendleton, mentally cursing the ADA for making a sloppy objection. Overruled, Sterling ground out through clenched teeth. The witness will answer. Hayes cleared his throat. Yes, it is standard practice. Defense moves to enter Exhibit 4 into evidence, Henry said. No objection, Pendleton mumbled, his face turning a shade of pink. Admitted, Sterling said sharply. Get to the point, Thomas. Mr. Hayes, Henry continued, completely unruffled. According to that authenticated log, I scanned out of the building at 6:15 p.m. on October 14th. There is no record of me scanning back in. If my physical fingerprint is required to access the server room, how did I execute a local download from the secure terminal at 11:43 p.m.? A murmur broke out in the jury box. Hayes adjusted his tie, his smooth demeanor cracking just a fraction. Well, the system can be accessed remotely via our VPN. Ah, the VPN, Henry nodded thoughtfully. So it was a remote hack. Interesting. That brings us back to the digital server logs. Mr. Hayes, who extracted the digital forensics data that proved my credentials were used via the VPN. We hired an independent, third-party cybersecurity firm to handle the extraction and analysis, Hayes said, regaining his footing, to ensure complete neutrality. And what was the name of that firm? Henry asked. Apex Digital Forensics, Hayes replied. At the judge's bench, Harrison Sterling's pen froze in midair. A sudden, chilling tension seized the muscles in his neck. He looked up, staring sharply at Henry. Brenda, the stenographer, noticed the judge's sudden stillness. She looked from Sterling to Henry. Henry was holding a pen, tapping it gently against his chin. He looked directly past the witness, locking eyes with Judge Sterling for 3 agonizingly long seconds. The polite, out-of-his-depth amateur was gone. In Henry's eyes, Sterling saw the cold, calculated gleam of a predator that had just locked the cage door from the inside. Apex Digital Forensics, Henry repeated the name slowly, letting it echo in the cavernous room. An excellent firm, very reputable, very well-connected. Pendleton, oblivious to the sudden shift in the judge's demeanor, stood up. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. The firm's reputation is not on trial here. Judge Sterling opened his mouth to sustain the objection, but his voice caught in his throat. Apex Digital Forensics was not just a well-connected firm, it was a firm quietly owned by a holding company. A holding company registered in Delaware. A holding company heavily controlled by Judge Harrison Sterling's brother-in-law, a fact that was buried under layers of shell corporations and blind trusts. A fact that Omnitech had used to funnel $500,000 to Sterling's family in exchange for securing a conviction in this exact trial. No one was supposed to know that. It was impossible for this pro se nobody to know that. Your Honor? Pendleton asked, looking confused at the judge's silence. Sterling swallowed hard, his throat suddenly completely dry. I will allow it. Proceed, Mr. Thomas. Thank you, Your Honor, Henry said, a ghost of a smile finally touching the corners of his mouth. I have no further questions for this witness at this time, but I reserve the right to recall Mr. Tend. Hayes, after we review the metadata from Apex's extraction. As Hayes stepped down from the stand, visibly shaken by the sudden change in the courtroom's atmosphere, Pendleton felt a creeping sense of dread. He looked at Henry Thomas's perfectly organized table. He looked at the thick stack of documents still sitting in the battered leather briefcase. They hadn't trapped a desperate man. They had walked blindly into a slaughterhouse. Whispers saturated courtroom 302, a low, buzzing static that Judge Harrison Sterling made no immediate effort to silence. The air conditioning had kicked in, yet Alex Pendleton, the assistant district attorney, found himself tugging at his suddenly restrictive collar. The prosecution abruptly rested its case after only 2 more perfunctory witnesses, thoroughly derailed by the icy precision of a man they had mistaken for easy prey. Henry Thomas stood at the defense table, his posture relaxed, his cheap suit now looking more like armor than a mark of poverty. He addressed the court with the calm resonance of a maestro raising his baton. "The defense calls Gregory Pierce," Henry announced, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Pendleton stood, masking his unease with loud indignation. "Objection, Your Honor. Mr. Pierce is not on the defense's witness list. He is the lead cybersecurity contractor from Apex Digital Forensics, hired by the state. This is highly irregular." Judge Sterling's stomach churned violently. His eyes darted toward the heavy mahogany doors of the courtroom, then back to the self-represented defendant. Sterling knew exactly who Gregory Pierce was. Pierce was the man who had fabricated the digital logs to frame Henry, acting on the direct, clandestine orders of Sterling's brother-in-law, William Danforth, who secretly owned Apex. "Overruled," Sterling croaked, his voice cracking. He cleared his throat loudly, trying to project his usual booming authority, but it emerged thin and hollow. The state relied heavily on Apex's forensic report. The defense has the right to examine the architect of that report. Bailiff, bring in Mr. Pierce. Pendleton stared at the judge, dumbfounded. Sterling had been sustaining every minor prosecution objection all morning. Now, when it mattered most, the judge was rolling over. Gregory Pierce walked into the courtroom looking like a man marching to the gallows. He was a sharp-featured man in his late 30s, wearing a gray suit that suddenly seemed a size too large. As he took the oath and sat in the witness box, he refused to make eye contact with Richard Hayes, the Omnitech CEO, sitting in the gallery. Henry approached the podium, resting a single manila folder on the wood. "Good afternoon, Mr. Pierce," Henry began smoothly. "You authored the State's Exhibit 12, the comprehensive digital forensic report that allegedly proves my credentials were used to access the Omnitech Secure Vault and wipe the primary servers on October 14th. Is that correct?" "Yes," Pierce answered, his voice tight. "I conducted the packet analysis and reviewed the firewall logs. According to your report, the breach occurred via a virtual private network, or VPN, connecting from an external IP address. You traced this IP address to a router located in my apartment complex. Is that your sworn testimony?" "It is," Pierce said, sitting up a little straighter, retreating into the comfort of his technical expertise. "The ISP records confirmed the IP lease belonged to your building, and the MAC address, the unique hardware identifier of the computer, matched the laptop seized from your residence by the police." "It sounds terribly damning," Henry mused, pacing a few steps. "A matching IP address and a matching MAC address, a perfect digital fingerprint. Except, Mr. Pierce, as a cybersecurity expert, you are well aware of a software tool called Wireshark, aren't you?" Pierce's left eye twitched. "Yes. It's a network protocol analyzer. And you are also aware that MAC addresses, while hard-coded into network interface cards, can be easily altered or spoofed at the software level using basic open-source terminal commands. Correct?" "Objection," Pendleton interrupted. "Speculation. The witness cannot guess if the defendant spoofed a MAC address." "I am not asking him to guess, Your Honor," Henry pivoted smoothly. "I am establishing the witness's technical knowledge regarding the reliability of the evidence he presented." "Overruled," Judge Sterling muttered, staring a hole into his desk. "Answer the question, Mr. Pierce." "Yes," Pierce swallowed hard. "MAC addresses can be spoofed. So, if someone wanted to frame me," Henry continued, his voice rising just a fraction, projecting the dramatic beat perfectly for the silent, captivated jury, They would simply need to know my computer's MAC address, which is logged on Omnitech's internal network, every time I connected to the employee Wi-Fi and spoof it on their own device. Then, they would just need to route their connection through my apartment building's unsecured public router. In theory, yes, Pierce said defensively, but that is pure conjecture. Is it? Henry walked back to his table and picked up a thick, bound document. Defense introduces Exhibit 9. This is a certified BGP routing log, obtained via subpoena from Level 3 Communications, the Tier 1 Internet backbone provider for the greater Chicago area. Pendleton shot out of his chair. Your Honor, we have never seen this document. This is a blatant violation of discovery rules. Your Honor, Henry retorted, pulling a stamped receipt from his pocket. I filed this document with the District Attorney's Office 3 weeks ago under the standard reciprocal discovery rules. If Mr. Pendleton failed to read the defense filings because he assumed I was an incompetent, pro se nuisance, that is a failure of his office, not a violation of procedure. A stunned silence fell over the gallery. Even the jury foreperson, a retired schoolteacher, raised her eyebrows in sheer impressed amusement. Judge Sterling looked at Pendleton, who was frantically rifling through his own disorganized banker's boxes. The ADA's panicked face confirmed Henry's claim. The exhibit is admitted, Sterling ruled, his fate now inextricably tied to whatever bomb Henry was about to drop. Mr. Pierce, Henry said, stepping right up to the witness box and handing him the log. Tier 1 backbone providers log the true origin of data packets before they are encrypted and bounced through localized VPNs. I have highlighted a specific packet sequence time-stamped exactly at 11:43 p.m. on October 14th, the exact moment the servers were wiped. Can you read the true, unmasked originating IP address for those packets? Pierce stared at the highlighted line. His hands began to tremble. The paper shook violently. Read it, Mr. Pierce, Henry commanded, his voice suddenly cracking like a whip. 800 a 2,5. 800 a 8 Pierce stammered. Read the registered owner of that static IP block, Mr. Pierce. It is printed right next to the numbers. The courtroom held its collective breath. Brenda Fowler's fingers hovered motionless over her steno machine. Omnitech Solutions, Pierce whispered. Executive Suite, 45th floor. Pandemonium erupted in the gallery. Pendleton slumped into his chair, the color entirely draining from his face. In the back row, Richard Hayes gripped the wooden bench in front of him, his knuckles turning pure white. The call was coming from inside the house, Henry said coldly, turning his back on the witness to look directly at Hayes. The hack didn't originate from my apartment. It originated from the CEO's own private network. You didn't catch a thief, Mr. Pierce. You were hired to launder a digital crime scene. Judge Sterling slammed his gavel repeatedly, though he looked as though he wanted to crawl under his bench. Order! Order in this court! Henry turned back to the judge, his eyes blazing with an unyielding fire. I am not finished, Your Honor. The digital smoking gun only tells us how the servers were wiped. It doesn't tell us why. For that, we need to follow the money. The court took a mandatory 15-minute recess to restore order, but no one left the room. The atmosphere was highly combustible. The jury was leaning forward in their seats, completely spellbound by the unfolding drama. When Judge Sterling retook the bench, his usual aristocratic arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by the cornered look of a desperate animal. Henry Thomas was already standing at the podium. He had dismantled the prosecution's timeline and their technical evidence. Now, he was preparing to dismantle the men who had orchestrated his ruin. Your Honor, Henry began, his tone dropping to a conversational, almost deadly quiet volume. The state's entire case rests on the premise that I attempted to steal Omnitech's Project Apex algorithm to sell to a foreign competitor. They claim the algorithm was destroyed when the servers were wiped. But what if the algorithm wasn't destroyed? What if it was simply relocated? Pendleton, now thoroughly demoralized, didn't even bother to object. He simply watched Henry with a mixture of horror and awe. Before working at Omnitech, I spent 5 years developing the core architecture for what would become Project Apex, Henry stated to the jury. It is a highly advanced data compression protocol, and because I wrote every single line of that foundational code, I knew its quirks, I knew its vulnerabilities. More importantly, I knew my employer, Richard Hayes, was a corporate vulture with a history of claiming independent intellectual property as his own. Henry walked over to a large monitor set up by the prosecution earlier in the trial to display their fake server logs. He plugged a secure USB drive into the court's presentation laptop. Because I knew Mr. Hayes' reputation, I embedded a persistent, encrypted beacon deep within the algorithm's root directory, Henry explained, typing rapidly on the keyboard. A digital homing pigeon. It lies dormant until the algorithm is compiled and executed on a massive scale. Once activated, it pings a secure server I maintain, transmitting the exact physical and network location of the host machine. On the large monitor, a black terminal screen appeared, filled with scrolling green code. Mr. Hayes fired me, stole my work, and locked me out, Henry continued, turning to the gallery, his eyes locking onto the billionaire. He then logged into his executive suite on October 14th, copied the algorithm to a secure drive, and wiped the company's servers to make it look like a disgruntled employee burned the house down on his way out. He framed me to explain the sudden disappearance of Omnitech's most valuable asset. Henry pressed the Enter key on the laptop. A high-resolution global map illuminated the courtroom screens. A bright, pulsing red dot appeared, not in Chicago, not in a foreign country, but in San Francisco. That red dot, Henry pointed firmly at the screen, is the active location of the stolen Project Apex algorithm. It is currently running at maximum capacity on the server farms of Kensington Global Capital, Omnitech's largest market competitor. Pendleton stood up, his voice weak. Your Honor, the state was completely unaware. I'm sure you were, Mr. Pendleton, Henry said, offering the prosecutor a brief nod of genuine pity. You were just the blunt instrument they used to carry out the hit. Henry pulled a thick stack of financial documents from his briefcase. Defense enters Exhibit 14. These are authenticated SWIFT wire transfer records, subpoenaed through a FinCEN suspicious activity report. On October 16th, 2 days after the servers were wiped and I was arrested, an offshore holding company controlled by Kensington Global Capital wired $45 million to a Delaware C Corp registered at 1209 North Orange Street in Wilmington. Judge Sterling's breath hitched in his chest. 1209 North Orange Street, the Corporation Trust Center. The exact address of the shell company that owned Apex Digital Forensics, the exact address of the trust controlled by his brother-in-law. And who owns that Delaware C Corp, Mr. Thomas? Pendleton asked, completely abandoning his role as the prosecutor, now acting more like an investigative partner desperate for the truth. The C Corp is a blind trust, Henry answered, his voice ringing with absolute, crushing authority. But the primary beneficiary of that trust is a man named William Danforth. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Every lawyer in Chicago knew who William Danforth was. He was a prominent socialite, a wealthy investor, and the brother-in-law of the Honorable Judge Harrison Sterling. Henry turned his gaze slowly, deliberately, up to the judge's bench. Sterling was pale, his hands shaking so violently he had to hide them beneath his black robes. Mr. Danforth's trust, Henry spoke directly to the judge, his words slicing through the silence like a scalpel, is the sole owner of Apex Digital Forensics, the very firm Omnitech hired to frame me, the very firm that presented falsified evidence in your courtroom, Your Honor. This is an outrage, Sterling sputtered, though there was no fury in his voice, only naked terror. You are making baseless accusations against this court. I am making no accusations, Your Honor, Henry said calmly, stepping away from the podium and standing directly in the center of the courtroom, an immovable pillar of truth. I am simply presenting the chain of evidence. Richard Hayes sold the algorithm to Kensington Global Capital. He used a fraction of that money to pay William Danforth's firm, Apex Digital, to fabricate the forensic logs. And then, Omnitech used its political leverage to ensure my case was assigned specifically to courtroom 302. To your courtroom, Judge Sterling. Henry let the silence stretch, letting the devastating reality settle over the room. The jury looked at the judge with undisguised disgust. Brenda Fowler stopped typing, staring at the man she had worked under for 15 years, finally seeing the corruption beneath the pristine robes. I have forwarded these exact SWIFT transfer records, along with the unmasked BGP routing logs, to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Public Corruption Unit, Henry announced. As we speak, federal agents are executing search warrants at Omnitech headquarters, Kensington Global Capital, and the Wilmington, Delaware offices of Mr. Danforth's Trust. The sound of the courtroom doors slamming open shattered the tension. 3 men in dark suits with FBI badges clipped to their belts strode down the center aisle. Richard Hayes bolted from his seat in the gallery, making a desperate dash for the side exit. But 2 heavily armed court bailiffs, who had just heard the entire conspiracy, stepped squarely in his path, their hands resting ominously on their service weapons. The lead FBI agent bypassed the gallery entirely. He walked past Ada Pendleton, past Henry Thomas, and stopped directly in front of the elevated wooden bench. Judge Harrison Sterling, the agent said, his voice echoing in the absolute stillness of room 302. Please step down from the bench. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, obstruction of justice, and violating the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The gavel slipped from Sterling's trembling fingers, clattering uselessly against the mahogany block. The reign of courtroom 302 was over. The metallic ratcheting of steel handcuffs echoing through courtroom 302 was the only sound that mattered. Judge Harrison Sterling, a man who had spent 3 decades sending men to prison with a casual flick of his wrist, now found his own arms pulled roughly behind his back. The pristine black silk of his judicial robe snagged and tore against the heavy leather belt of the arresting FBI agent. Chaos did not immediately erupt. Instead, a heavy, suffocating shock blanketed the room. Brenda Fowler, the court stenographer, finally took her hands off her machine, watching wide-eyed as federal agents read Sterling his Miranda rights right there on the elevated mahogany bench. Across the room, Richard Hayes had not made it to the heavy oak doors. 2 U.S. Marshals, tipped off by the FBI raid team, had already entered the rear of the gallery. They intercepted the billionaire CEO of Omnitech Solutions, slamming him face first against the polished wood paneling. Hayes screamed for his corporate lawyers, his face contorted in a mix of fury and sheer panic, but the agents simply patted him down and hauled him out into the harsh fluorescent light of the public corridor. Gregory Pierce, the cybersecurity expert who had lied under oath just 20 minutes prior, sat frozen in the witness box. A junior FBI agent calmly walked over, tapped him on the shoulder, and silently gestured toward the door. Pierce stood up on trembling legs, knowing his career, his freedom, and his life as he knew it were entirely over. Amidst the ruins of the prosecution's case, Assistant District Attorney Alex Pendleton remained glued to his chair. He looked at the empty judge's bench, then slowly turned his gaze to the defense table. Henry Thomas was quietly packing his battered leather briefcase. He aligned his color-coded folders, capped his cheap pens, and snapped the brass clasps shut. He moved with the exact same unhurried, methodical precision he had displayed when he first walked into the courtroom facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Pendleton stood up, his throat completely dry. He walked slowly across the center aisle. "Mr. Thomas," Pendleton rasped, his voice devoid of all its former arrogant swagger. I had no idea. The DA's office did not know about the payouts. We relied on the police reports and the Omnitech affidavits. I swear to you." Henry picked up his briefcase and looked the prosecutor dead in the eye. There was no gloating in Henry's expression, only a profound, heavy clarity. "Ignorance is not a defense, Mr. Pendleton," Henry said softly. "You didn't look closer because you didn't want to. You saw a poor black man without a law degree, and you saw an easy conviction to pad your win rate. Next time you stand in a courtroom, remember this day. Remember who you are actually serving." Henry turned and walked down the center aisle. As he passed the jury box, the foreperson, the retired schoolteacher, stood up. One by one, the other 11 jurors followed suit, standing in silent, stunned respect as the man who had just dismantled a multi-million-dollar criminal conspiracy walked freely out the heavy oak doors. The legal fallout was swift, brutal, and utterly unprecedented in the state of Illinois. The next morning, the chief judge of the circuit court reassigned Henry's case to a special federal magistrate who took one look at the FinCEN wire transfer logs and the BGP routing data and dismissed all charges against Henry Thomas with extreme prejudice. But the story did not end with Henry simply walking away. The trap he had meticulously laid triggered an avalanche of hard, unforgiving karma. Within 48 hours, the Securities and Exchange Commission halted all trading of Omnitech Solutions stock. When the news broke that their flagship Project Apex algorithm was entirely fraudulent, stolen from an employee, and secretly sold to cover massive corporate debt, the company's valuation dropped by 94% in a single afternoon. The board of directors fired Richard Hayes, but it was far too late. Hayes was indicted by a federal grand jury on 32 counts of corporate espionage, wire fraud, and perjury. He was denied bail, deemed an extreme flight risk due to his offshore accounts, and remanded to the Metropolitan Correctional Center. William Danforth, the judge's wealthy brother-in-law, attempted to board a private jet chartered for non-extradition territory in South America. Federal agents apprehended him on the tarmac at O'Hare International Airport. The Department of Justice seized his Delaware blind trusts, liquidating his entire fortune under civil asset forfeiture laws. The hardest fall, however, belonged to Harrison Sterling. The FBI raid on his private estate uncovered a staggering paper trail of corruption spanning over a decade. Sterling had not just taken bribes from Omnitech. He had been operating courtroom 302 as a private toll booth for Chicago's corporate elite. Stripped of his judicial immunity, his law license, and his state pension, Sterling stood trial in a federal courthouse down the street from where he used to reign. He was found guilty on all counts under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations (RICO) Act. At 62 years old, the former king of Room 302 was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, surrounded by the very men he had ruthlessly and unjustly locked away. As for Henry Thomas, the digital homing beacon he embedded in Project Apex did more than just prove his innocence. Because Omnitech had technically terminated his contract before illegally seizing the code, and because they had subsequently wiped their own servers of all foundational data, Henry was recognized by the United States Patent and Trademark Office as the sole inventor and owner of the Apex architecture. Kensington Global Capital, desperate to avoid their own federal indictments for receiving stolen digital property, agreed to a massive, quiet settlement. They surrendered all rights to the code and paid Henry an 8-figure licensing fee for the temporary use of the algorithm. 6 months after the trial, Henry stood in the penthouse office of a sleek, glass-walled skyscraper in downtown Chicago. The faded navy suit was gone, replaced by a perfectly tailored charcoal wool. He looked out over the city skyline, the founder and CEO of Thomas Dynamics, a cybersecurity firm that was already revolutionizing data protection for the modern era. He had walked into a rigged game with nothing but his intellect and the truth, and he had walked out owning the board. Justice is rarely swift, and it is almost never freely given to those without power. Henry Thomas walked into a rigged courtroom facing a 20-year sentence, armed only with a dollar store legal pad and an unbreakable will. He didn't just beat a corrupt system, he completely dismantled it. It stands as a chilling reminder: never underestimate a quiet man who knows exactly how to read the fine print.